do an initial structural overview of the Gospel of Luke Acts. Probably, written probably somewhere people think in general between 64 to 85 AD. I think there's arguments across that whole spectrum depending on how you approach it. And so there are a lot of things one can ask at this stage. Now, first question you're going to ask me, if you're normally being used to growing up in church and so forth, is you're thinking, what do you mean Gospel of Luke Acts? In fact, if you aren't familiar with Christianity, you're like, okay, sure, I'll take that. Although the issue most people do not realize is that Luke, the book of Luke, and the book of Acts are actually 2 volumes of the same work. Written by, at least ascribed to Luke, and no good reason to think not, although there are certainly scholars who have conversations on all sides of this. But it is written as one work, and it is written to Theophilus. And in Greek, that basically means lover of God. Theo being God. Philos is sort of, if you can think, is one of the forms of the word of love. And so you think, oh, this is written to one who loves God, which could be a person, so that certainly would be a name. It could have been to a community. It could have been to the whole church. We don't really know. We're so far removed, we really don't know. But clearly these are meant to be 2 chapters of the same work. Luke very much is about the life of Jesus primarily, and the move in Jesus' life starting from his infancy narrative, moving towards Jerusalem for Holy Week, for the Passion Week, and his resurrection. Acts is the second part, which does start with a little bit of Jesus being ascending into heaven, and then the early church forming, developing, growing in Jerusalem, and then moving out into Judea, moving out into the entire Roman world, and ending in Rome, showing that it has now moved into the entire civilized world. For those who are wondering, well, didn't Christianity move outside of the Roman Empire? Yes, it did, actually. And some of the apostles did do that. We know of even conversations of the Apostle Thomas heading to India, to Kerala, into that region. But it very much what you can see of what Luke's writing is very much focused within the Roman Empire perspective, moving from Jerusalem to Rome. But we have to understand that it's one conversation, it's one work. And so, yes, we have the Gospel of Luke, which clearly has connections to the Gospel of Mark. There are things that seem to be in common between Luke and Matthew. How that happened, no idea. Some people say that there might be a joint source and there might be some other pieces. Fair enough. There's a lot of things that one could discuss. But basically, we can definitely see a structure around the book of Luke that feels very similar to the other 2 synoptic gospels, but there's some subtle differences here. And in many ways, it's also setting up a conversation going into Acts. And so when you look at this structurally, there's a few things that one notices. But a first couple of things that are important to notice, one of which is that this whole conversation, particularly in the book of Luke, is you have this whole sense of the world orders being turned upside down. And if you think about it, this continues through Acts. But you see this over and over again right from the very beginning. You see this in Mary's for the Magnificat, which shows up right at the beginning here. In fact, you have the birth narratives here in Luke, but it's much more from Mary's perspective. This is where we have the stories of Mary's journey, Mary's view with Mary being seen with the angel, but also this whole world being turned upside down. So we also see, in this case, it's the shepherds, it's the lowliest of professions that shows up at the manger. It's not the Magi we might see in Matthew. There's a constant conversation here, and Luke also makes a point of having Jesus's visit to Nazareth being very early, to then have the words coming in chapter 4 that came out of Isaiah 61, right? That, he is to proclaim the good news to the poor, sent to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, or sort of jubilee in the Jewish world. And you think that this is a very strong sort of statement that shows up again and again and again. What you also see is certainly the core aspect of the Galilean ministry. This has a lot of parallels, particularly the core feeding of the 5,000, conversation, who do you say I am, and so forth. But then what you see at about 9:51 is this sort of discussion of we are now going to go towards Jerusalem. And many of the stories come through this journey to Jerusalem. And we see this whole conversation, and there's this pointing towards we are going to head to Jerusalem. There will be Passion Week, which feels actually quite similar to Mark's version of it. There's always some small differences, but there's a lot there. And then you have the resurrection accounts, which includes, for example, the road to Emmaus. And in many ways, it's interesting because it then continues, and the ascension of Jesus, which then again gets repeated in Acts. And then we start to see the early church. We see that how the church expanded out of Jerusalem due to sort of persecution that would happen. And then we see this important event of Paul's conversion right next to this sort of a key event of Paul and Cornelius, which was basically the beginning of opening up to the Gentiles and the response in Jerusalem to this effect, which then eventually would come down to the Jerusalem Council again and would be something that would constantly be a struggle all the way through. In fact, it would be around issues of this that would eventually have Paul come back to Jerusalem and eventually be arrested and eventually be sent to Rome. So this entire sort of theming and sort of the discussions of the struggle seem to be very, very real. And we see this in Paul's letters and in other aspects as well. So we kind of know that this was a very key part of this. But the whole Gospel of Luke Acts brings so many pieces together. And really, really important to kind of sort of see it structurally of what it's doing. And then so many of our favorite stories and parables start to have even greater meaning, greater understanding. And we start to see what is the author actually trying to get us to understand. And what is the author trying to show us in the middle of this gospel.